Bryant, thanks for joining me today. So you're the congressional reporter at Defense News, yet you travel down to the naval shipyards that I typically write about in the Gulf Coast. So what did you find out during your trip about the relationship between the shipyards and these lawmakers and sort of how these new leadership positions may benefit the yards that you went to visit?
Yeah, so when I went down there, it was a congressional recess, and I wasn't expecting this when I made the trip. But the same week I was down there, there were a bunch of staff-level delegations to all these shipyards kind of making the rounds. So, you had a bunch of Senate staffers visit Ingalls and Pascagoula, Mississippi. They also went to Bollinger's new facility there where they'll be constructing the polar ice cutter for the Coast Guard. You had a bunch of House staffers check out Austell down in Mobile. And, when I was in Eastern, Congressman Mike Waltz, he is a Florida congressman, but that's not even his district. He was visiting Eastern shipbuilding. So that kind of shows the increased focus or attention on Capitol Hill.
Certainly. And in my coverage of these yards, we've often seen congressional delegations down there where, it's not just the local lawmaker, the state senator, but they also bring with them Navy officials, Marine Corps officials. And there's really sort of this interesting dynamic of, the lawmakers taking ownership of these yards and wanting to show off what their workforce, what their people bring to the Navy and the Marine Corps. I've always found it really interesting to see kind of this relationship and sort of this ownership that they take of the yards in their states.
Well, you have a yard like Ingalls, for instance, which is, I think, Mississippi's largest employer. But all these yards in the region are competing for limited workforce pools. So, you have the typical incentives for elected officials to to promote jobs in their states. So they have their own interest. But the thing is, there's a very limited pool of labor to draw from in the Gulf, especially within the shipbuilding industry. They're also competing with industries like oil and natural gas. And I think there's a growing sense that this is probably the biggest capacity constraint the shipbuilding industrial base faces. So, one thing I saw when I was down there, a lot of these shipyards are poaching each other's workforce, and at the same time, they're all very focused on trying to draw more workers to the region, which is somewhat difficult to do. In your trips elsewhere to other shipyards, both in the Gulf and throughout the country, I understand this is like a pretty common issue. So, have you seen that elsewhere?
Certainly. And actually, if you look at certain lawmakers like Congressman Joe Courtney up in Connecticut, he has electric boat in his yard, and he's been very active. He actually sits not only on the House Armed Services Committee, but also the Labor Committee, and has really leveraged that position to help make some labor-related changes, education benefits for people to go to trade schools, the incorporation of welding and electrical work and those types of things into high school and college curriculums. And so you can really see where these lawmakers are obviously interested in the well-being of the shipyards, but they can leverage their position in Congress to make other changes to help support the yard and the workforce. So obviously workforce is a big challenge. Let's talk about the other challenge, which is sort of this tension between the Navy, the DoD, the Congress on what ships they want to buy and how many of these ships they want to buy. We have this interesting situation between the Navy and OSD where there's not necessarily agreement, particularly on the amphibious ships that are built down at Ingalls where you travel to. But ultimately, Congress gets the final say. Congress gets to decide how much money goes into the budget and what ships get bought. So what conversations did you have during your trip about sort of the role of making the case, not necessarily to the Navy, but making the case to congressmen for trying to get contracts awarded to these shipyards? And then also, I know there's obviously the yards all have their lobbyists in DC. Kind of what role are they playing in the background to really make this case to lawmakers who have the ultimate say in what ships get bought?
Yeah. Well, actually, I was talking to a lobbyist while I was down there who jokingly referred to like their conversations in DC as like the meeting of the five families from The Godfather. So, they're all competing, obviously, for contracts and even just like basic things for workers, but they're all very cognizant that, if one shipyard tanks in the region, that's at some level bad for their business as well. So they're all very cognizant of that. And honestly, they, at least the impression I get is they, another person told me, sometimes Congress tells the Navy what it needs, so what they need. So my impression was they're pretty confident that they don't want to take anything for granted, of course, but they do rely on these lawmakers from shipbuilding states to stop to help with programs that the Navy may want to end or pause in the case of amphibious ships.